want to welcome you to the Titans of Foodservice podcast. I'm thrilled to have you on today. You have accomplished so much in the food service industry, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Maybe we could start off of, how did you get into food service?
That's pretty interesting to me after all these years. When I got out of college, I went to work for a truck dealership in Kansas, and at the time, they were one of the largest Mack and International Harvester dealers in North America, and very successful. And recession hit, and the oil industry crashed and burned. And I had a friend that worked for Lamb Weston, who was, as you well know, a manufacturer of French fries. And that was my start with him. Now, I didn't go to work for Lamb Weston, but I went to work for a Lamb Weston broker in Kansas City, and was there over 20 years and ended up building a lot of great relationships. But most importantly, what happened was that I observed a multitude of different management approaches, how they went to market, how they treated their employees, what kind of culture they had, what kind of leadership they have, and ultimately their strategies on innovation, on managing their distributor relationships. And after you work with 50 or 60 people over the course of the years, you get a pretty good idea of what's effective and what isn't. And that was really the heart and soul of how I began my company in 2007. But you observe things that work, that don't work. And many of the companies I work with today, some are family owned, some are corporate. They range in size from, multi-million to multi-billion, depending on who they are and where they fall. But I think from my viewpoint, it's still about three things that I've learned from the very beginning. It's about leadership. Secondly, it's about the culture. And third, it's about the strategy. And if you're really focused in on those three things in your business today, you can accomplish great things. And that's carried through, for a long, long time. And I appreciate all the technology, but it's a tool in the toolbox. It really boils down to people and their effectiveness and how they become self-managed as people. And to me, that's the difference in a really successful business or one that is simply getting by.
I love
Does that make sense, Nick?
I think that makes sense to me. I love that a lot. I know you have so much experience working on the broker side and now being on the consulting side. You've worked with many food service manufacturers and brokers, both on the food service and retail side, and then even outside of the industry as well. So your mark has been pretty remarkable, no doubt. You mentioned that the companies that you work with, they're anywhere between multi-million to maybe multi-billion. But you mentioned that you work with family-owned and then also corporately owned companies. What are kind of maybe some of the differences that you see between those two?
Well, I think when there's in a corporate environment, governance is a big challenge. There's boundaries when there's publicly traded companies. So there's quite a bit of difference between that and a family-run business. And when you have multiple shareholders, depending on what kind of corporate structure you have, you're not just reporting to the sales manager. Really, you may be reporting to a board of directors, or you may be reporting to, in this day and age, to private equity, who are a lot of times the owners. So, there is a big difference. A family-owned business, they make decisions a lot faster. They make decisions that they can live with. Both have benefits, and I think it's all about, again, it goes back to whether you're in a corporate or family-owned business, it still goes back to that leadership, culture, and strategy, and how you maximize that growth, through your people.
Sure. Let's go a little deeper on the leadership, culture, and strategy. Let's start with leadership. When you come in and work with a company, what are kind of the first metrics that you look at in terms of their leadership?
Well, Let's start with culture first. I think that's
Okay.
really an interesting place to start.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
one of the first things I do is measure their corporate culture or their family culture. And the idea is that, um, what really exists there? What kind of numbers exist? For most companies, culture is a subjective number. I feel good about culture. I think it seems okay. Where I go with that is a managed culture where we have metrics that really define in 10 areas the success of that culture. And, if you balance out culture, leadership, and strategy, it's like an equilateral triangle. It's only as big as the largest side. So, a lot of times, managers will say, this is the best company I've ever been at. And they have a score on a cultural assessment that may be a little bit challenging, and you find out that the facts really aren't there. So addressing leadership from a factual perspective rather than a guess and a gut feel probably is a lot better solution set to me. I would always rather know the facts and work to address that. If you take that leadership and you break that down, most people want something that's understandable, and that means from a predictable, or are leaders predictable? Do they employ critical thinking? What really drives that? Are they value based? And one thing I think that hasn't changed in the years I've been in business, throughout my career, is there's three things leaders just have to address, and it's team, job security, and compensation and benefits in that order, in that precise order. And I think for some companies, compensation is number one. Where if you look at the most successful companies today, they're thinking about the employee too. Now, some might disagree. If you got 25,000 people or 50,000 people, can you really take pride in that? I think you can. I think you can balance that out no matter what level you're at. And it's very true that with larger companies, you have to have systems and processes to get you there. But I still think you can have a team-based company do tremendously well and understand that people and families are important. And you really see that in the retention rates. If you go to the HR and you have discussions with the HR team about accountability, about retention, and understand that great teams don't magically happen; they're built. There's no magic in this. It's all about people. But what the assessment does is give you more than a subjective idea. It gives you facts and analytics to help say, you know what, we need to work here instead of maybe there. A lot of companies will say, we need to grow our sales team. We just need more. We need more sales training. When it kind of goes back to the leaky bucket where customer retention is so poor that they'd have to have a 15% increase just to get over the 15% attrition rate from their customers. So they've got to come up with 30% growth. And year after year, that's virtually impossible to make that work. So it really goes back to a lot of other things other than sales training. But that also applies in production, logistics, HR, financial, across the board in departments. Why are things the way they are, and what limits a company's progress going forward?
Sure.
My view has always been leadership and culture and strategy work together harmoniously. And if you have low scores on culture, your leadership's probably struggling with solutions. And a lot of it has to do with communication, but some of it has to do with personalities and behaviors.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you can go a little deeper on that cultural assessment, that's very unique. I haven't really heard of any other people talking about doing that, but I think that's very important. I think our culture or a company's culture can be a strategic advantage to them against their competitors. When you do the assessment, are you interviewing the employees? Are you interviewing the customers? How does that look like? And what are some of the specific measures that you look at when doing the assessment?
So the assessment measures 10 different areas, and from training to onboarding to management leadership, innovation. if you think about every employee in your company, they're really ambassadors to your customers and your suppliers. So if you think about the cultural assessment, you also have two teams in your company. You have a management team and you have an employee team. So you really have to break your assessments out into two different areas because one doesn't necessarily reflect what the other side will say. And it's really a balancing act, understanding that. But some companies get into challenges because, the information isn't transmitted down effectively to the employees from the management. But sometimes, we create our own heartache because we really don't have any boundaries for our teams either. And we don't hold our managers effective. When I do these assessments, they're really an interesting dialogue of communication between senior management. And sometimes, they're in tears because, it's not always a great message, but sometimes it's a wonderful message, And but I think what's helpful to understand is culture is not as subjective. I wrote a book this last year, and the title on that was Anonymous Cultures, the Silent Majority. And the reason you do online assessments is the vast majority of employees and managers, they're not comfortable having an interview like we're doing today. They're more comfortable being anonymous. They're going to share their thoughts and viewpoints in the anonymous phase of what they do. And, it's really enlightening to think about, my best employees, giving me insight. A lot of times they know more about the business than some of the mid-management teams. And they're out there. They're doing battle every day. And what it also does is force management to really look at source versus symptom. Think about that, source versus symptom.
I've never heard that before.
For example, revenue is not a source of conversation. Really, it's about how do we build revenue. Revenue is a measurement of success. But if we go back to the source, it still goes back to leadership, culture, and strategy, because that's the source of the revenue.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It totally does. Maybe dive a little deeper down into this source for symptom. How do you break out the two and maybe describe it a little bit more in detail?
So if you think about the assessment, higher scores in the assessment process mean that the company is more strategic typically for me. I design my own questions because they need to be actionable, they need to be accurate, and they need to be realistic. And that's why I break it down into the 10 areas. But typically, the responses come back from employees, and there's really three challenges there. Equal accountability. People are not equally held accountable for their job, responsibilities and duties, and their performance. The team or lack thereof. And then finally, predictable communication from management. It's always interesting. It typically always follows within those three, the scoring. Now, the rating scale that I use, for example, is from 0 to 100. I keep it very simple in each area. Mm-hmm. But what you find is that companies that score between 0 and 70 are typically task-based. They're more interested in tactical moves rather than strategic moves. As they move from the 70s to the 80s and 90s, they become more strategic. And when they become more strategic, they're more objective-driven than task-based. And you see different accomplishments. They're able to multitask. They're able to better mitigate risk. They're better able to understand the behaviors of certain teams, why those things occur. They're also able to make long-term plans. So instead of the typical, what are we going to do tomorrow versus 1 year, 2 years, and 5 years and 10 years. So as they become more strategic, they're able to address those issues. and it kind of goes back to, is it ready, aim, fire, or fire, aim, and go through the
Exactly.
dysfunctional processes that normally occur. So, it really is a different outlook. And the assessment gives us benchmarks. So if we're doing, if I have a really challenged company, I might do organizational assessments every 6 months. And really what that is establishing perception. And perception is what the employees and the management team feel about the company. They feel about the customers. And sometimes what they feel about suppliers. Now, with that said, perception changes. It's like the wind. It can change good or bad depending on the environment. So if you have a really toxic environment, your culture is going to be challenged. If you have a really facilitating environment, culture is going to probably be higher. And a lot of that comes from just good listening skills on the management team and then doing something with it. It's it's a responsibility of management to walk the talk, to say, hey, this is where we're going, and we explain it to the employee teams, why it's invaluable and why it's important. So the cultural health of the company is really determined by the employees and the management. That perception is a lot of times based on the vision, mission, and core values, because the vision, mission, and core values create the boundaries of behaviors within the company. The vision sets out where are we going. The mission is how we're going to get there. And the core values state how are we going to behave with our customers, our employees, and our suppliers, and our society. So by setting those boundaries in place and really understanding those, we take our thinking process to a different place. It's more critical thinking, in my view, but it also says to every employee, you're valuable, you're an asset, you're not just a number, and we need your input. When I first started doing the assessments, Nick, it was numerical. And then I layered in some essay questions. And you would just be astounded at some of the things that managers and employees say. And they'll just tell you the truth after they trust you. I make mine anonymous. I don't share who said what, but I share what they say. And the idea is it's not about holding somebody accountable in this. It's about getting better. It's about leading your company to different opportunities.
I read a book recently called They Ask and You Answer. And part of the premise of the book was around, your employees and your customers, they're talking about you, and are you listening? It's very important, I think, especially as leadership. It's easy to get caught in your day to day. And I think it's a mistake that a lot of people make, or not necessarily a mistake, maybe a trap, where they get caught in the day to day and they don't focus on the strategic part of their business, which might net you that 0 to 70 score that you were mentioning. When you come into a company and they're in that range of 0 to 70, are there quick tricks or tips that they can do to bump that 70 up, or is it more of a longer term play?
Every company's on a different timeline. There isn't established a rubber stamp to make this work. A lot of companies today have been in business 100 years. You think about it, it took them 100 years to get where they're at. Any consultant that would come in and say, hey, I'm going to fix 100 years of dysfunction in 6 months is obviously not being truthful. But I'm more into how do we facilitate and modify cultures and leadership for the long term. I think a lot of people make unsupported promises, and they just don't work out, and it doesn't fare well for the consultant. But long term, it's more about understanding your business. I think a lot of companies and senior management, and depending on the size of them, are removed from the customer relationship. One of the more interesting things is when you line up assessments and you look at the employees, the management, and then you do supplier assessments and distribution assessments, you line them up and they all have about the same message,
Right.
and
Very
that
interesting.
changes the tune of management. It makes them more aware. It illuminates challenges, but it also illuminates opportunity. And you balance those out. And how do you get better? Well, a lot of times our suppliers are really tuned in. Are you the first company they go to for innovation, or are you the last guy because your purchasing department's maybe not on the up and up? Do they really have great systems and policies in place, or are they so difficult to work with they don't bring you an opportunity? In the brokerage world, it's about creating value. If we create value, it starts with our people. If a manufacturer comes in and works with a broker and it's just a wonderful day and you're calling on high value operator accounts, multi-units, that's considered a great day. If you come in and the manufacturer's rep comes in and says, we went out and called on, 8 small accounts and our revenue probably is not going to be great over this, they're questioning why they have you. And we choose our customers, and it starts with the culture of the company. It starts with the leadership, really IDing what's important to them, what's the priority. And leadership sometimes has to make hard decisions because sometimes sales employees are not driven to call on those larger accounts. And those large strategic accounts are the ones that can ultimately drive the business forward.
Now, you mentioned, on the manufacturing side, are you first or are you last in terms of, your supplier working with you versus your competition? And then also on the broker side, when a manufacturer comes into the marketplace to do a market visit, a lot of times we may not know that they have an issue, or we may not know that the trip was really good or that our service level is very high. Do you do an assessment for your clients or the companies that you work with, their customer base?
I think the manufacturer and broker need a direct relationship and communication. And it's important for the broker to assess their relationship with the manufacturer every time they come into the market. If you think about the manufacturer, they're sending in their regional sales manager into, say, LA, and by the time they have airlines, transportation, hotels, the whole bit, they've probably got $1,500 to $2,000 tied up in that daily cost. Now, if they're not out making effective calls, whose responsibility is that? Well, it starts with the sales agency. They need to guide the manufacturer to those best accounts. And to me, I think I've always been an advocate that the broker should assess that relationship with the manufacturer. And it can be as simple as an email saying, did we do a great job or not? Were we on task or not? Was it strategic? Are you satisfied? Because our role as brokers is to create value with the manufacturer. And honestly, if I'm a manufacturer and I'm, say, a national sales manager, and I send my team in to make these presentations in a market, and they come out with very little, I'm questioning the effectiveness. I'm questioning the value. So I think it's important for the broker to toot their own horn, but do it on facts. We solved these issues. We accomplished this. And if we're always doing that, we're going to build a dynamic relationship with that manufacturer. Now, here's part 2 of that. Okay. Everybody wants to expand their product list if you're a manufacturer,
Of course.
and that's where that innovation comes in. So if their goal is innovation and they send their representatives into your market and you have a great day calling on large accounts that you have a relationship with, your success with innovation is probably going to be a lot higher, a lot greater than if you were to take them to accounts that are cold calls, that are
Mm.
people you really don't know. In fact, the numbers statistically are about 30% sales effectiveness when you call on uh, uh, strategic accounts you have a relationship with. As opposed to that, if you cold call on people and it's just Joe Blow up and down the street, it drops down to around 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So there is effectiveness there. And if you look nationally at a lot of manufacturers, they'll put out, multitudes of innovation, and the vast majority die. They don't go anywhere. Where if we chose those strategic accounts to begin with, we would have had a great relationship and we probably would have been successful in doing so. In the broker side, if you think about it, it's kind of the 95-5 rule. 95% of your commissions are tied up with 5% of the products for most lines. If you look at the manufacturer, the same thing applies. It used to be 80-20 where 80% of the revenue comes from 20% of the products. For a lot of companies, that's tightened up. A lot of companies have accommodation items that may be co-packed. They may not have the equipment or logistics to handle that. But whether you're a broker or a manufacturer, by spending your time on those value added, those core foundation items, you're able to really impact your commissions, but you're also able to satisfy and create value with the manufacturer. So it's a double-edged plus for everybody, to
Definitely.
do that.
On the innovation piece, when a manufacturer goes to create a new item, of the manufacturers that you've worked with, what do the successful ones do to introduce that new innovation into the marketplace? Or how do they get their brokers to go in the right direction? And what does success look like to them versus others who struggle to introduce new innovation?
So, innovation is more than just taking an item and making it different than what you already have. If it's truly innovative, you're going to change the world with it. And again, it goes back to where are you going to go with that? Now, some organizations are not strategically driven. Sales agencies are not strategically driven. They're more task-based. And they really don't focus in on the idea that strategic accounts can buy more than a B or C account. Quality manufacturers, and I think that's why, some manufacturers have chosen to go direct. They want those relationships out there.
Mm-hmm.
But innovation is the lifeblood of a manufacturer. It allows them to stay relevant. But it's also the lifeblood of a broker to remain relevant with the manufacturer and the strategic account.
And how would you've mentioned the term strategic account. How would you define what a strategic account is, or maybe who a strategic account would be?
So if you looked at in food service, if you looked at all the classifications of strategic accounts out there,
Mm-hmm.
you would have, multi-unit accounts, restaurants. You would have hotels, casinos. You would have schools, healthcare. You would have prisons, for example. So you would pick the top 10 or 15 top targets in those channels and identify which ones make sense for you. Now, most people are challenged today with hiring enough people and retaining them. The fact of the matter is that if we are calling on the right accounts, we probably need fewer people. We need to expect more out of our people by calling on the right accounts. And I think distributors help push that opposite of what the result is over the years by maybe having you as a broker be the sample logistics company out there. You're delivering samples to see accounts when really we could have hired a cartage service to deliver that for a third of the money.
That's very true.
So that's really what it amounts to. But the truth of the matter is that if we're calling on strategic accounts, it ups the game. It changes the perception of the manufacturer to the broker, but it
Yeah.
also creates a relationship between the manufacturer and that strategic account that is based on profitability rather than cost.
When I first started in the food service brokerage industry, I felt that the industry had trended towards what does your distribution, especially your broadliner relationship or relationships look like? Do you feel that has shifted more towards the strategic accounts or large impact operators, whatever you want to call them? Do you feel that has moved over, or it's just or not fully yet?
Well, the brokerage business is an interesting business from the standpoint you really have three customers. You got the manufacturer, you got the end user, and you got the distributor. And I can tell you as a broker, I never once received a check from a distributor. And the fact is that the manufacturers write the checks. They expect results. And if you're going to retain them, you need to call on the right people. And I think that's where, especially during the pandemic, a lot of relationships ended because people moved on or changed jobs. And I think today there's a great lack of relationship building out there amongst sales agencies with the correct accounts. I think people have reverted back to what they did 20 years ago, and the fact that they called on everybody when they should be very selective on who they call on. And that's not to say we don't call on them. It's that we don't make personal calls with them. We'll send them samples. We'll send them information. We can talk to them on the phone. But do we personally go out and sell them? No. We're in front of those strategic accounts where we need to build those relationships. And I would ask you the simple question. If I'm in front of a strategic account and I'm there once a year, do I really have a relationship with them?
Yeah, probably not.
Probably not. But if I'm touching them 2 to 3, maybe 4 times a year with personal contact, I'm doing e-commerce marketing with them, I'm communicating with them, their chances of respecting me and valuing me as a salesperson is dramatically different. They require trust. They're going to buy from somebody they trust. And they know that, for example, if they go to Portillo Sales, they know they can trust that you're going to take care of any challenges they might have. They're going to be happy with that decision. But that's just the way people think.
Right.
It's like with a manufacturer, Nick. If they have a customer service department that is just outstanding, the customer knows that the product's 100% guaranteed. They know they're going to get results, and they know they're going to get compensated if there's a loss. Now that's trust. And that's, I have clients that have had the same customers for 30 and 40 years. And you go, wow, that's a long time to have trust. But essentially that's why they're successful, is their customer attrition rates are so low, maybe 2%, maybe 3%, as opposed to 10, 15, maybe 20% attrition rates.
So in terms of getting to more of the 2 to 3% attrition rates, in the history of my company, we've had years where we have pushed maybe 10 to 15% attrition rates. I think it had a lot to do with being newer and not really having our footing. But what about companies that are well established and they're still dealing with high attrition? What are some of the missteps that they're taking to have that happen?
Well, without getting specific, to me, it goes back to what kind of relationship do we have with those customers that we're losing? Are we really ambassadors? Are we really having a conversation? I think, and I use the email and I use text and I do all these things, but there's nothing better than picking up the phone and calling somebody today and saying, where have we dropped the ball and why? A lot of times we use technology as an excuse. And when we should just pick up the phone and say, you're dropping us, but why? I want to learn from this. And you know what? If I can apologize and start over, I'll do it. But, if you look at attrition rates and it's a strategic account, most companies need to wake up and say, look, it's not the customer's fault. It's our fault.
Mm-hmm.
We have challenges, and maybe it's a quality issue, but maybe it's a logistics issue, or a third party issue. But let's find out the facts. Let's understand source versus symptom.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of goes back to, internally it can be, well, why are all these employees leaving us? Is it, we're just hiring the wrong people, but maybe we have a manager that's not facilitating the success of their people.
On the employee retention side, what is because there is attrition when it comes to employees. We'd like to hold on to all of them. Some companies do much better than others. What is an attrition rate that you see of the more strategic companies who have that equilateral triangle of leadership, culture, and strategy versus those that maybe lack and are maybe more tactical? How does that attrition rate look differently between those two?
Well, in my view, and has always been that you start off with a great job description, Nick. If you know what you're hiring for, and you know the top 3 or 4 key performance indicators that person's going to do, you hire based on the ability of the applicant to achieve those key indicators. That's the first step. The second step in this is the idea of hiring people based on gut feel. I think is a huge challenge for a lot of companies. I think you have some greatly experienced people out there, but that shouldn't be the first step. The first step should be understanding that everybody's different. Everybody brings different skill sets to the table. They bring different knowledge levels to the table. And here's the interesting thing. They all travel at different speeds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a lot of times that attrition comes from how people learn. And people learn normally 3 different ways. They're visual learners, they're auditory learners, or they're kinesthetic learners. Now, if your training process is all online, it's all about visual learning, and you have someone that's a kinesthetic learner, and a kinesthetic learner is the person that needs to touch and feel and romance that product, you've lost them. And I've studied this for a long, long time, and the society's really broken up into 3 different levels. It's a third, a third, and a third. And there's, some people that can learn with all 3.
Sure.
But if your training process doesn't embrace all 3 learning approaches, you've lost them at the very beginning.
That's a great point.
And if the attrition rate is high, you start back with what's the source? And the source is, how do people learn? You have to establish how people learn.
Mm-hmm. How can leadership establish how somebody learns? How can they find out if someone is visual, audio, or would you use the word kinesthetic?
Kinesthetic, and that's touching. Well, you generally ask the person, how do they best learn? And you'll see the schools today were very poor at addressing the kinesthetic learners' needs. And you see some of the best salespeople in the world that are kinesthetic. They generally have a lot more empathy toward people, but they require multiple ways to learn. I have a son who was a kinesthetic learner all through school. He was challenged, and now I don't know what happened, but his brain rewired, and now he's more visual and auditory, and he's got a great hybrid balance of all 3. But that's what started me in thinking about how people learn and the value of that. And then you start applying that to sales departments, to production departments. Why do some people grasp what's going on and others don't? Why does the timeline vary between different people? And a
Mm-hmm.
lot of it has to do with management's lack of knowledge about how people learn, and understanding that if I show people how to learn and I understand the value it brings, I'm probably going to retain more. Is it perfect? No. The other side of that attrition, which you're talking about, is that when you look at your vision, mission, and core values of a company,
Mm-hmm.
and the employee gets there and they find out that the company is not even close to the vision, mission, and core values, they're going, I'm going to move on. And that's really going on in society today, because
Yeah.
that's why you see some turnover, just excessive, because the company really is a walk and their talk. They're really
Mm-hmm.
not uh, engaged with the employees. They come, they fail, they rehire, and it's just a revolving door. Whereas
Right.
with my clients, we look at why are people succeeding, and then look at why are they failing. What does that have to do? And it starts at the top. It starts with the senior leadership, the C-suite. It starts with understanding that it's not a perfect world, but if we want to hire uh, quality people, we have to do a good job of selecting quality people.
Definitely. Yeah, that's very important. You mentioned you have a book that you wrote, Anonymous Cultures, The Silent Majority. What is your book about? Or does it really go into kind of the different topics that you've been talking about?
It's available. I had never written a book before, Nick, and I took all the things I've worked with companies on and learned
Takes a
over
lot
the
of effort.
years and kind of put it in this book, and it turned out really nicely. It's
Oh,
available
that's
on
great.
Amazon. It
Okay.
has it's pretty involved. It's available on audio or Audible, and also on Kindle. It has done pretty well. Could have done better yet, no question about it. But for my first one, I thought it was pretty interesting. Um, the idea is that you look at leadership, strategy, and culture, and they all play on each other. When somebody tells me that they're not successful in innovation, they're kind of stuck in
Mm-hmm.
a rut. Well, it goes back to those other two topics. And
Right.
to me, it's about taking the fundamentals and getting it right. Um, this is a copy of it right here, and it's inverted, but it's a thought provoking book with a lot of good ideas in it. I have another one coming out in 23. It's
Yeah.
based on I've written a lot of articles and papers over the years, and it's really an aggregate total of all those. But writing is an interesting thing. It forces you to really look at yourself and what works and what doesn't. And I
Yeah.
would tell you that everything in this book I've used and done. I'm not an academic. I went to Kansas University and got a degree and enjoyed political science, and found out it had no value unless I wanted to
Right.
go to law school. So it's really about understanding people, the psychology of people, how they learn, but what helps people get to a different place. And the managers that think they can motivate people, I think it's a fallacy. You got to create an environment where they're self-motivated, they're self-managed. And I use that term a lot, self-management. And self-management means you have to do four things consistently. You got to plan, schedule, execute, and report. If you do those things consistently, you're self-managed. Now, if you only do three of those, you're partially self-managed.
Right. Oh, I love those. Self-managed. I think every leader out there probably, wants employees or team members that are self-managed, and it might be even a little bit of a holy grail to find somebody like that. A really self-starter, someone who's not just has the desire and the want, but also the capability and the capacity to be self-managed, and so that you can drive the company forward. I think that's really impressive. Now, when it comes to your book, I mean, kudos to you for writing that. One of the reasons I started the Titans of Foodservice podcast is when I started out in food service, my dad, also my business partner, said, Nick, you need to get out there. You need to drag the bag. which means you got to go door to door to different restaurants with a bag of products and just kind of get the feel for it, learn by doing. And he said there are no books on food service. You can't read a book and be on how to be successful in food service. And so now, 7 or 8 years later, I decided, you know what? I want to create content for people that maybe they're new into the industry, or maybe they've been in for a while and they're trying to move up the corporate ladder, or they're trying to start their own business in food service. I wanted to give as much value to those people as possible. So, you writing this book, I just have to commend you. We need more resources out there, especially in the food service community. And because I think when we learn from one another, we grow as a community. So kudos to you. And I appreciate you taking the time to write that book and putting your thoughts into it. You're very profound, and you have incredible ideas, very well spoken. And I think you think a lot differently than most people do. I kind of, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of people, especially leaders, get caught in their day to day, and they don't take a moment to take a step back. And I'm guilty of that myself. Take a step back and view their business more holistically, as opposed to just in the trenches every day. If you could give advice to a leadership team out there, whether it's a food service manufacturer or food service broker or retail broker, on one thing that they should really be focused on or should be doing differently, what advice would that be?
You know, a lot of companies started off as entrepreneurial businesses, and they a lot of times quit doing what made them successful in the beginning. And it really is about going back to the basics and saying, we need to call them the right accounts. We need to show those accounts the right products. And we need to construct what kind of customer we want to call on and stick with it, and that's called a model. But if you think about the entrepreneur, a lot of times, I have people call me all the time, they're a startup, they got some seed capital, they're doing stuff, and I always try to give them a great time, because I remember starting off when I was going. And, hard lessons can be very painful, both financially and emotionally. And, I've learned from my lessons. I just wrote a paper a while back, Fewer Teachable Moments. And it's on my website. But, if every time you do something and it fails and it becomes a teachable moment, you send a wrong message to your employees. And that's where I think that you have to take the time to really maybe not move quite as fast, but think the consequences. Think about what could happen. What's the worst case scenario out there? And maybe not do it. Because your employees are looking to the management, the senior management, particularly the owners, of leading them to a path of stability. The vast majority of employees want to get up every day and go, this is the best place in the world to work. This is great. Yes. I make a good living. I'm safe. My job security is high, and I'm held in esteem by management. Now, some people listening to that may say, well, that's a little naive. When I would say those people are great leaders, because they facilitate the success of every subordinate in their building. Mm-hmm. That's how you build a great company. You allow people to grow and learn, and you give them every opportunity. People aren't suddenly, as I mentioned earlier, they're not suddenly failures. They had a progression of fails, and it's really up to management to step in and say, look, what's going on here? But it's not so much for that employee, it's for all the rest of the employees that observe that. And whether you've got 25 employees or 25,000 employees, there has to be systems and processes to help make that successful.
Definitely.
And you can't run a large organization without having boundaries. Everybody has expectations. But here's the thing. If it's not a safe environment, it's toxic, or you have unequal accountability, people read through that in a second, particularly the younger generation. And you know what? I really don't blame them.
Right.
The truth be known, I've seen companies without job descriptions, without any reason for younger employees to stay. Today, over 50% of the workforce is from the younger generations. And we need to be adapting to that smartly and use that critical thinking, because it's just not good enough to allow toxic conditions to continue in these companies.
Right.
And some managers they think that's okay. I simply don't share that view.
Right.
You know.
How can people find more articles from you, like your Fewer Teachable Moments article? Is there a website that they can go to, or is there a way that they can reach out and contact you? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
So my website is called Tacticware.com. You can go to that. Most of the articles are listed at the bottom. I've written a lot of articles over the years. Some are on LinkedIn, some are in trade journals, but they're written so people understand them and it makes good sense. There's a lot of educated people with poor judgment, and if you think about that, it's more about the wisdom than it is the word flow. And to me, it's about using common sense to address the challenges of your company. And every company's got challenges. If they tell you they don't, I would question that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's about being fair and decent to your people, but also I look at a lot of the senior management in these companies, and because they are tactically driven or they are just task-driven companies, they work themselves to death. And if you're a C-suite guy and you're working 80 hours a week just to keep afloat, maybe there's some challenges there you ought to address. And it happens.
Yeah, no doubt.
But sometimes third parties, are like myself, and there's other great consultants out there that do a good job, that will tell you the facts and base it on facts, not subjective thoughts. And that's where a lot of people get in trouble, is subjective criticism. I'd rather deal with the facts, let them stand on their own, and if they don't agree, well, that's their prerogative. But you generally have most people I work with are very tuned in to, they want to get better. They want to get better at what they do. They want to understand the people and understand the employees are their greatest asset.
100%. Paul, this has been just a delight to have this conversation with you today. I really appreciate you coming on to the Titans of Foodservice podcast. I think you have given the listeners and viewers of this podcast a lot of great nuggets, and this is power-packed with a lot of very valuable information. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, and we'll have to do it again.
Let's do it again, Nick. As always, a pleasure.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much.